You're listening to the Author Stories podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. This week's guest is author of Wick in Pennsylvania, Michael Bunker. Find all episodes at hankgarner.com. Welcome back to the Author Stories podcast with Hank Garner. My very special guest this week is writer, iconoclast, and reasonable man, Michael Bunker. Nice to have you with us, Michael.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. Michael, you are an interesting fellow. Let me just start there. I came across you a few months ago on Amazon with your Pennsylvania series of books that you were releasing as I guess novellas,
Right.
and got really intrigued and interested at this idea of Amish science fiction, and kind of fell into the rabbit hole head first, and have been a Michael Bunker fan ever since.
Awesome.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. How long have you been writing? And we'll get into in a minute sort of your what sets you apart from a lot of authors out there. But kind of what's your history with writing?
I've always been writing. I mean, I think a lot of authors will say that. I was writing when I was in seventh grade. I remember writing stories pretty regularly when I was in school, and I think I wrote my first really novel-length piece of work probably when I was 21 years old, and did nothing to really get it published, which is good because it wasn't any good. But I mean, I think it was something that's always been part of me. I don't have the history that most authors do of the kind of going through the whole mainstream pub, submissions and rejections and all that, because early on, I had a short story that was published I went to Texas Tech University, and my creative writing teacher submitted a short story that I wrote to a college magazine that was based on art and poetry and short stories and that type of thing, and it got published in that college magazine. And at that point, I thought, this maybe could be a career, maybe something I might be interested in. And at that point, I went and looked at the process to actually submit stuff. Right. And it was so daunting then that sure. I'm the kind of person that if I go to a restaurant and there's like 4 people in line, I go home. I don't stand in line for anything. I don't anything that seems like it might be trouble. And so, I mean, I say that because I know so many writers have worked so hard and gone through that, but I really avoided it. And so I was always writing, and then I really got into nonfiction writing. And that really, with the onset of the blogging in the 90s and all that, and websites, I did a whole lot of nonfiction writing, and only really dipped my toe back into fiction writing in 2010. And this was before I knew anything about, the whole self-pub revolution and all that. So I'm actually fairly new at the fiction game.
Well, let's talk about your nonfiction for just a moment, because you wrote a pretty incredible book on living off-grid. Can you tell us about how that came about?
Yeah, my family, we had, I was raised just like anyone else, and we were raised middle-class America, and I got married in 1992, and 1994, 95, my wife and I decided we kind of wanted to get out of the rat race, so we moved from Dallas, Texas area to Lubbock, Texas, which was a little slower. Not a whole lot, but a little slower.
Right.
And then in 1997, we moved to a small 5-acre farm outside of Lubbock, and that's where we've kind of got our feet wet in off-grid living. In 2005, then I moved where I live now, and we started an actual off-grid farm. And as I went through this entire process, I was blogging, and that was really during the blogging revolution. And so I got a pretty big audience. And in 2010, I started writing a blog where I was picking a topic as far as off-grid living, and I would do a chapter every week. And it really, really picked up a lot of momentum. And I had a guy who owned a big off-grid website who asked if he could publish it serially through his site, and then eventually there was just this huge mass of opinion that it needed to be a paperback book. I mean, I didn't have any concept of the Kindle revolution at that point, and so I had some friends that were able to make things into books, and they did a lot of research for me, and then we looked at it, and we found out about KDP, and we found out about CreateSpace, and had no concept of ever, trying to mainstream pub it. We self-published it, and that book went to number 29 on all of Amazon on the first day.
That is amazing.
And yeah, it was shocking, and I had no idea what I was doing. And of course, then you think, wow, this is easy. Why isn't everybody doing this? And so I decided I would. And people had always really connected with my writing, and so I thought, this is easy. I'll just do a fiction book. And so I wrote my first fiction novel, which was The Last Pilgrims. And it was my first, and it could have been a whole lot better. And I've gotten better as a writer, but my experience was not the same. It was more along the lines of what most people experience. It was a tough road to get known, and to try to get your head above water so that people would know that the book was available. And so the success didn't automatically translate from the nonfiction to the fiction. So it's been a job. It's an employment to build an audience for fiction.
Yes. And so what do you think the catalyst for that demand for that first nonfiction book about living off the grid? What do you think sparked that?
I think it was. Oh, go ahead. You were gonna follow up.
No, go ahead.
I think it was a combination of the timing. This was 2 years after the 2008 economic kind of collapse, and a lot of people were troubled about what was going on in the world. And I just think there was also a very big movement at the time of people who have no real survivalist mentality, but who really, whether they were from the far left or the far right, were really interested in back to the land and more wisely utilizing our resources and living a more sustainable life. So I think all of those things kind of combined together. At one point, it was pretty remarkable because I had people who were reading my stuff that were, like I said, from the far right, from the far left, from all over the place, and the book just really kind of resonated. I mean, it was being blurbed and picked up by real diverse groups all over the internet. So it was just a weird combination. But that, like I said, that doesn't naturally translate into fiction. You pretty much have to start from ground zero.
And I'm sure it also helped that in writing that book, you were able to come from a place of authority on the subject, having gone through that transition. And do you think people picked up on the sincerity of that?
Well, yeah, and I think that most books that were about off-grid living were really just about an alternate way of providing the same things that how people lived before. So, you still had a blender for your margaritas, but instead of being powered by the grid electricity, it's going to be powered by solar power. So my take on that was completely different. Ours was a look back on how did people live in comfort and provide for themselves without any of that. So it's called surviving off-grid. So not just off-grid as far as providing your own alternative grid. So I think it was a new thing, and a lot of people hadn't really thought that way. And the word of mouth really took off on it. So I had hoped that then when I went into my first fiction book, which was a post-apocalyptic concept of a plane community living 25 years after some type of systemic disaster, that the same people who were interested in the fiction book would have been interested in the nonfiction book, and that really just did not turn out to be true.
You call yourself plain. What is the difference in plain and Amish?
Okay, plain is a more umbrella term that includes all of the Amish, Mennonites, Hutterites, a lot of different groups, and even some who are just generically plain. The term plain merely means that the person or the group or the family have eschewed some of the traditional ways of doing things and of living, and usually that involves some deliberate use or not use of technology, usually a plainer mode of dress, A lot of that has to do with the idea of not competing, not uh, taking on expense in the way that you are clothed and all of that. And a lot of it has to do with really trying to live in a way where you can provide for yourself. And so a lot of our plain clothing has to do with the fact that we want to be able to make it. And so it's not going to look
Sure.
like the stuff you buy at the store. But we just call ourselves plain, although we are associated or friends with Amish groups and Mennonites and others. And a lot of people just automatically assume that we're Amish because of the look. And we're okay with that too. We don't insist that anybody use any type of terminology. The Amish, for the most part, are a very there is no monolithic thing that is Amishness. Every district and every community is completely autonomous and make their own rules and all that. So as far as that goes, we could call ourselves maybe very liberal Amish, but we don't. We just try to simplify things, and we just call ourselves plain.
I got you. Um, and do you get kind of the odd looks from people that, wow, here is someone who appears to be Amish, who's plain, but is a very prolific author and very um, present
Right,
on social media. And I know that you have a very uh, well-trafficked Facebook profile.
right.
And do you find yourself constantly answering these questions to people? And by the way, I love your YouTube series where you answer people's questions. I think it's fantastic, and you do it in a very um, respectful manner toward people, if that's the correct word. Where I think it would be very easy to kind of respond to people in a
Right,
similarly negative fashion, but you
right.
do it in a way that you really kind of bring people along with you, and that's a beautiful thing.
Well, I appreciate it, and yeah, it's. I get the question probably, if not every day, several times a week. And this, the question really is kind of seated in a few things. It's seated in a little bit of a misconception about what the plain people or the Amish actually think about technology,
Yeah.
because the society and especially the kind of false shows on TV that portray the Amish in a certain light have kind of adopted the idea that the Amish are anti-technology, which is ridiculous and not true. I mean, a ballpoint pen is technology, and a frying pan is technology, and a screwdriver is technology. So we're exactly like anybody else. We just draw the lines in different places because nobody uses all technology. Nobody at all. Every one of us draws a line at what we're going to accept and what we're going to use, and we have our own reasons for that. And so it's very easy, and having come from a non-plain perspective, and someone who actually visited Amish country back 20, 30 years ago and had the same types of thoughts, it helps me have a little bit of empathy for that mindset, because I understand now that my conceptions about the Amish were just erroneous. And so the plain people really just are very deliberate about what technologies they choose to use. And most Amish groups or Mennonite groups do allow different levels of technology in different situations that may seem to be hypocritical to people that are outside because they weren't involved in the decision-making process. First of all, and second of all, because they have a different set of values. And so as part of being understanding of each other's cultures and all that, we just have to understand that without that background, it does look hypocritical to see a plain person, willing to ride in the car with somebody else, but not willing to own a car. And so, but there are very real and rational reasons that people would understand if they knew them.
Right.
And so with our life, like most of the Amish in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, or others, a lot of plain people do work outside of the home or off of the farm. A lot of them work in factories. They work in the, making recreational vehicles and cabinetry and those type of things. And in doing so, they use equipment and they use machines and they use telephones and those type of things. But they separate that from their home life, not because they're saying to the world, these things are evil and that makes you evil. They're saying, we don't want these things because of some things that come along with it. And so with us in our cabin, which is here on our property, we live without electricity, without running water. We do things differently, and we like the way that we live. And yet I have an office where I write that is off grid, in that I have solar power and some generators and that type of thing that allows me to utilize the internet as part of my work. And a bit, it's a part of almost a peacemaking effort in being able to explain, because our group does allow this, to explain this way of life to people who might otherwise have these misconceptions.
Well, it's a wonderful thing because most of us that are not plain, the only conceptions that we have of plain people are what we see in movies, and we should all know that those are horrible misrepresentations
Right.
of anything. So,
Especially the reality shows that are on today, which are completely
oh, I could,
false and ridiculous. And yeah.
I have not seen those, but I could only imagine. I could only imagine. Uh, when you and your family decided to pursue this path, uh, was this something that took a great amount of you know, thought and planning? Did you guys, just say one day, we're going to do this, and then just start adjusting your life that way, or was this a more of a deliberate process that you went through?
I think it was a very organic process. The philosophy came first, and the philosophy was, as we would do things on our farm that was in West Texas, that we were on grid and we had a well and that type of thing. We would just ask ourselves, okay, if we did not have access to this, for example, if the power went out, how would we feed these animals? Would we just let them die? Would we have to find some other way to do it? And so as we asked ourselves that, we said, okay, we don't mind utilizing these resources, but we at least want to try what life would have been like before these resources were available. So, for example, buying bagged food at the store, we would actually start to grow some of our own and start to harvest it by hand, and to see what that process would take. And so it was, a lot of it was just family experimentation. We went to the power box and shut the power off for the weekend. That's kind of how it started. And then every project we engaged in after that, whether it was processing animals or whether it was anything to do with our little farm, we always asked ourselves, okay, how would we do this? It's something as simple as digging a hole.
Right.
There's this tendency, because of kind of utilitarian mindset, to just go rent a backhoe and dig a hole. And we decided, like when we first moved out here to our land, we wanted a root cellar, and about 3 feet down was solid bedrock. And so how would that have been done? Because in this area of Texas, when people first moved out here, one of the first things they built was a root cellar, because it was very hot during the days, and they would sleep in the root cellar as they built their house or whatever. So we decided, for the first hole we were going to dig on the ground, we were going to do it by hand. And so, that's kind of the process that we've gone through in everything that we've done. We grew a field of wheat, and we took a quarter acre of that field and we planted it by hand. We sowed it all by hand. We harvested it by hand. We winnowed it by hand. We processed it all the way to where it became our bread, and because we wanted to know that we could do it. Now, after that, I don't mind. I have a treadle thresher now, and we don't mind bringing in a guy with a harvester now, because we know we can do it. And that's really our lifestyle evolved from that philosophy. And some of the things that we found out, we just found out we didn't really want them or need them. They actually brought more expense and more heartache and more trouble than what they were worth. So those things we just kind of threw out.
How much has your faith factored into this journey that you've gone in becoming plain and off grid and off grid?
Oh, I think it's been quite a bit. I came from a traditional mainstream middle class Christian background, and actually early on, probably in my late 20s, early 30s, I preached a little and those type of things, and I really became just very dissatisfied with the way that the church interacted with the world. And so really what we learned in studying the plain people, as people living humbly on the earth, not being offensive, not being violent, and really trying to just live our lives simply as an example became more of a motivation of our faith. And so a lot of it has to do with that. And also that flows through in my writing too. It's not, I try not to be preachy or try to be even really overtly religious, but I try to show in the stories that there is a different way to live. And with us, particularly, that is motivated by our faith.
That's great. Uh, so now that we kind of have an understanding of where you're coming from, that first fiction book that you wrote after your off-grid living book, uh, how did that story come about?
I'm a bit of a historian, and I've studied a lot of Russian history, and at that particular point of time, I was studying because of the Amish connection. We were studying the history of the Anabaptists, and as I went back through those stories, and I read everything I could find, we came across the story of the ancient Waldenses, who were a group of plain people who lived in the Alps in the fifth, sixth century after Christ, and then going forward. And their story really made kind of William Wallace's story look like he was a paper boy. They actually lived in the Alps, and the people tried to wipe them off the planet for 1,000 years, and they wanted to live their very simple way of life. And so I decided that, honestly, if somebody took the story of the Waldenses, no one would believe the movie. No one would believe it. I mean, there were times when there were 60 of them that went to battle against 60,000. And it even makes the stories like the 300 look weak. And these are true stories that were all documented. And so I thought, wouldn't it be nice to take that story? And within the Waldenses, there were people who were pacifist, and there were those that weren't. And there was a lot of stress between the two groups. And so I took that story and I transported it into our own future, 25 years after a systemic disaster that had basically sent the whole world back 500 years. And I had this plain group of people living in Central Texas, farming, and kind of this very medieval monarchies had risen up in the after the disaster, and they're trying to wipe out these plain people. And so then this militia group rises up, which was within the true story of the Waldenses, from their number, who determines to protect them. And so it allowed me to have all of the conflict, not only between the plain people in the world, the different religious systems, and also the people within the group who were pro-pacifism or pro-violence and self-defense. And I just wanted to create this really epic story as the first, as a part of in a trilogy. And so, not knowing really what I was doing, I just did it, and it did well. I mean, comparatively to what most books sell, it did fairly well. We are actually in the process right now of creating a new cover, and I'm going to be doing some rewrites, and we're probably sometime in 2015 going to do a re-release of that book.
What's the name of that book?
It's called The Last Pilgrims.
The Last Pilgrims. We will definitely keep a watch out for that. Did you find that using some of these stories that you found of the Waldenses, was it easy to take their story and recreate it? Was that easier than coming up with a story of your own? I guess what I'm asking is,
Right.
when you write, are you influenced by things that you see or you read about, or do ideas just come to you just out of the ether?
I think both things happen sometimes in different
Yes.
stories, and this one in particularly, I started with this root idea that I wanted to tell the Waldenses story in a way that would be more up to date and more modern. At the same time, the tagline of the story is 25 years in the future is 500 years in the past, and but at the same time, I ran into some difficulties, and one of those in marketing the book. The book did fairly well, not great, but it did fairly well. The concern that a lot of people who read the book, who really liked it, had was that since I come from a very Russian literature heavy background, And so,
That was going to be my next
yeah,
question for you.
so I wrote it in kind of that Russian style. So the enemies are very vague and very distant, and there was no explanation of the original collapse, and that became a problem, which is why I decided to write the Wick story, the Wick Omnibus, which is actually a prequel.
What is it about Russian literature that you love so much?
Oh, I think it's it's just the best, man. It's like,
I know you have a love for Dostoevsky,
right,
and
right, and Tolstoy and Gogol, all of them.
yes,
The thing about it is that the culture, the Russian culture, and then we're talking about pre-revolution, was
right,
around for 1,000 years. This
sure,
we're very very early in the American experiment as far as the culture goes, and it's very difficult outside of Asia to find a culture that is really identifiable in the Western mind that has been around long enough to have taught all of these lessons. And so I early on I started reading a lot of Russian literature, which a lot of people find to be really really boring. But to me, it was I'm a bit of an anthropologist in my mind, and to me,
yeah,
it was like the most fascinating study of how a culture develops and what we could learn from it. I mean, you can study the Roman Empire, you can study the Greek Empire, and you can learn some things, but some of that is so far in the past that it's not really readily available to our minds historically. So, and as I began reading it, I started War and Peace 3 times and hated it, and
didn't we all?
I couldn't get past the dinner parties, and it's like endless characters. There's like 5 billion characters, and
Right,
but I finally decided that no matter what was going to happen, I could not call myself a fan of Russian literature if I didn't at least read it, even if I hated it. And about 700 pages in, you realize all of that served a purpose. It is war and peace. And so he had to
right,
really, really establish what peace was like before Napoleon attacked. And so I became a huge Tolstoy fan. Anna Karenina is just a wonderful book. And applied so much to the things that I was learning. And so one of the things I've done is I've tried to adopt that storytelling feel in a lot of my stories, which I think a lot of people identify and some people just don't like it.
Did you see the movie treatment of Anna Karenina that came out a couple years
Yeah,
ago?
I did. I've seen it.
Yeah, did you like it?
No, I wouldn't say.
Yeah, it was pretty horrible.
Yeah, it was.
They murdered it. Yeah.
Well, and the whole hero of Anna Karenina is not Anna Karenina. She was a horrible person, and of course, so they bring in this hot Hollywood starlet to be the star of the movie. Anna Karenina, the character, was a moral cautionary tale. The whole book was
Right.
actually written as a conversion narrative of another male character who actually ends up uh, leaving the city to live on a farm and realizes that's where his life needed to be. So, yeah, they murdered the story, but I do encourage people that if you just love great romance, great everything, that's a great book to read.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned that we are very early on in the American experiment, and that I think it's very hard for modern people to, especially Americans, uh, to really grasp the idea of ancient culture,
Right, right,
and Russian culture especially, because a lot of us that grew up in the 70s, 80s, we look at that part of the world and can only see that through the filter of the Cold War,
right.
and communist Soviet Union, and there's so much more there
All
that
right.
that we've just been tainted against, and are frankly too shallow to look past. What would be a way that you would recommend for people to explore those old cultures, and kind of get past some of this surface fluff?
The short stories, Russian short stories, are not only fascinating. If you're an author, especially, the writing is just incredible. I'm reading Ivan Bunin's short stories right now.
Yeah,
Stories by people like Turgenev and uh, uh, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's short stories, uh, which a lot of his are post revolution, but he does harken back to what life was like beforehand. Turgenev's Fathers and Sons is a short book that is very, very powerful, that informs a lot about. Most people don't realize that communism, the idea of communism, and what we know about that led to the Cold War, was not a Russian phenomenon. It actually invaded from Europe, from Germany, and from France, from the Salons, same places the French Revolution. And what happened was that a lot of rich Russian aristocrats began sending their children to Europe to be educated, and that's where those ideas came from. And so um, it's all just very, very fascinating. So if you go back, hundreds of years prior to the revolution, you have a very comparable type of or understandable type of life and culture to early American culture. And so the literature is very, very similar. A lot of it has to do with hunting and farming and relationships between neighbors. And if you like Mark Twain and you like that era of American literature, you will love Russian literature. So I just encourage people to actually just read it and try to get past in your mind the idea that this is a very sad people who are in constant winter and all of these things, because there's a reason that Russia is what it is, and to understand it, you really have to go past what happened very, very recently. The revolution was very recent. It's a sliver in time compared to the history of Russia.
Yes. As an aside, the brothers Karamazov is one of my all-time
Oh
favorite
yeah,
books, and
that's a great
I
book.
have a yes, I have a real warm place in my heart. I had a high school English teacher who was rather subversive in the way that she would pass me books and say,
Right,
I don't know if you're ready for this, and kind of pull it back. And
right. The takeaway
yeah,
clothes. Yeah,
yeah, it's
yeah.
like, no, I've got to have this book now. So, but anyway, that's fascinating. So your book Wick um, has the logo has the hammer and sickle.
Right.
Tell us about Wick. What's that about?
Well, I had this idea that one of the reasons that the Last Pilgrims had not taken off as well as it could have was because Americans want to know what happened. In Russian literature, you may start in the middle of, or 20 years after Napoleon's invasion, and they don't explain what happened. It's just they're explaining what life is like now. And that's kind of what I did with The Last Pilgrims. And so I think a lot of American or Western readers really wanted to know what happened. So I decided to write this. And I had in my mind that there was a combination of a couple natural disasters combined with a sneak attack from the Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union, or agents of the former Soviet Union. And so there was a bunch of stuff that was happening in the news at the same time. And a good friend of mine who I went to high school with, Chris Awalt, was living in Brooklyn. And right after Hurricane Sandy, the day after, he actually walked through Manhattan taking pictures. And this really began to spark a lot of thoughts in me. And so I contacted him, and I knew he was a writer, and I said, hey, we ought to write this book together, and I want to write this very Russian novel. And I mean, 220,000 word doorstop. But I want to write this Russian novel, but set it in America, and I want to use a lot of Russian and communist themes. And so going back to my studies in Russia, there were a lot of people and a lot of Russian or Soviet defectors who actually said that they were going to fake the fall, that perestroika and glasnost were not real, and that they planned on waiting 25 to 30 years until America was the sole superpower and everybody in the world hated them, and then they would lash out. And so this has kind of been a recurring theme and a lot of things that have gone on in the news and all that since then. And so, I mean, right about the time when Hurricane Sandy happened, there was this Russian sub right off the coast of New Jersey. It was in the news, and all of these things in the news just came together, and I said, okay, we have to write this story. And in the story, this character just decides that he can't live in the city anymore, which is a theme in all of my books. And he decides that he's going to get out. Well, Hurricane Sandy hit, so he has to walk out. And so we just followed the pattern of Chris's walk through Manhattan, post Sandy. After he gets outside the city, if you'll remember, right after Hurricane Sandy in real life, 7 days later, there was a nor'easter hit the same area. And it was a
Right.
very, very destructive. And in fact, it was more destructive than the hurricane. And so we got our character caught in this nor'easter, and he's stumbling through the woods in the national forest, and he stumbles into this. And I don't really want to give too much away, but he stumbles into a prison that is actually a village. And so then the whole mystery unfolds from there, and it's a very long Russian style book, but it leads up to this massive systemic destruction of the world that 25 years later becomes the world of the Last Pilgrims.
Ah. So how was Wick received?
Oh, Wick did really, really well, considering the fact that I was really new at this. This was still within the first year and a half of me doing writing. We released Wick in 4 parts, um, basically almost novel length parts, and that did really.
Yeah, so they would have been nearly 50,000 words
Right,
each,
right.
huh?
And we released them in 4 parts. I think we in the first year we sold over 10,000 copies, which for a new writer that's pretty good. That's not
That's really good.
right.
That's really good.
And at the same time, there was a lot of people that just didn't like the book, and that's always going to be true, especially when you're doing something that's so experimental. And so
Right.
while we had finished writing part 1, and I had a little break in time. I had, I think, 2 weeks because the part that I had written was with Chris Awalt, and he was working on it. And so I had a little bit of time, and that's when I began writing some of my short stories. And I wrote the Hugh How I Must Die short story with Hugh's permission, and things really. And Pennsylvania, I wrote Pennsylvania that January, Pennsylvania Part 1, and that's really how things started taking off. It wasn't really the Wick story, and that's something I want to teach writers too, is that the one you think is going to be the one is probably not going to be the one. It's the one you're messing around with while you're trying to sell the one. That's the one that's going to be the
Right.
one.
Right. And sometimes you're just too personally attached to one story uh, to give it the attention that it needs, or or whatever. That's I've seen that happen over and over
Right.
again. That sometimes you're just too close to a story, and then you decide, well, I'm just going to write this throwaway thing, and then people go nuts over
Right,
that.
and I call them little litmus test or litmus strips, test strips. Sometimes I found this philosophy kind of on accident. During that month of January, February, 2013, I think I wrote 4 short stories, and then just kind of threw them out there. Pennsylvania was one of those, Pennsylvania Part 1, and I think we sold 167 copies in the first month, which is good. But then it just kind of started to snowball. And by that summer, when I was at Worldcon and met Hugh Howey and we were walking around together, there was kind of really this burgeoning. People were demanding Pennsylvania Part 2. And by a couple of months after that, I realized I had to write this story and get it out there because the demand for it was so high. And so that's really how Pennsylvania kind of became the focus of my attention after that. While I really thought that this magnum opus that we'd written was going to be huge, it turned out to be really something that helped and got my mind on something else so that I could write more purely in the Pennsylvania world.
How long did Wick take to write?
Oh, I think we started, I think the hurricane was October 2nd or 7th or something like that. It was sometime in October, and the election was like November 7th or something like that. There was some
Right.
idea that they might end up, so maybe the hurricane was like the 17th or something, because it was only 2 weeks before the election, and there was some idea that they might cancel the election or postpone it in the eastern states.
Right.
And so that all became part of the story. So we actually started writing right about that time, and we were writing real time events as they happened. And then that
Amazing.
was October, November. We put out Wick Part 1 in January, and out with Pennsylvania Part 1 and Hugh I Must Die, and I started doing some of the Wool fanfic. I think Wick Part 2, 3, and 4 came out pretty quickly by the middle of the summer of 2013.
Wow. And so you were working on Pennsylvania as you developed
Yes,
Wick?
yes. We had only finished part one of Wick. We were still, I think we were in the middle of part two. I think I had written maybe the first draft of part two, and I think Chris was actually working on it, which is why I had a couple of weeks. And during that couple of weeks, I knocked out several stories, and part one of Pennsylvania was during that couple of week break while I was working on part two of Wick.
How do you juggle those two disparate stories in your head at the same time?
It kind of helped that I was working with Chris, and Chris was able to. We already had a plan. We had written out a pretty in-depth plan for the four books, but at the same time, I was doing these short stories more almost like a palate cleanser, like you would eat a cracker after a glass of wine or something, and it had no concept when I published Pennsylvania. It wasn't called Part One. Um, it was a short story, and it had a very mysterious ending, but I had no intention of writing on it unless people demanded more of it. And so it wasn't really this idea that it was going to be this. I had a concept of where it could go, but I just threw it out there, and I thought, if people like it, I'll write more, and if they don't, I've got other stories. I got a lot of stories.
Right. Speaking of your writing process, and you're talking about planning out Wick, are you an outliner, or are you kind of write by the seat of your pants? What's your process like for
I
writing?
tend to be more of a pantser.
Yeah.
With Wick, with when you're writing with somebody, there has to be a lot more planning. I'm writing a book right now with Nick Cole called Digger, and so there has to be a little bit more planning, just so you know who's writing what and when and what all is going on. And so we do a little bit more outlining. But on the stuff that I write by myself, I'm usually a lot more. I mean, I have my memory is such that when I think of this story, it's almost a complete story. It doesn't have all of the details, and so I can keep that in my mind. And so I do have an outline. It's just not written out.
When you wrote Pennsylvania, did you have the entire story in your mind? You said it started as a short story, but could you see past that short
Yeah,
story
I
when
had a
you
very
began?
general idea of what the New Pennsylvania was like and where he was going, and I was in the middle of reading a lot of time travel short stories, which I love, and so I had these concepts of different ways to examine time travel, and so I did have maybe not all of the detail of who the characters were, but I had this concept of where New Pennsylvania was and what it was that I wanted to get to someday. But at the time that I finished the story, Pennsylvania One, where he's in the antique store and he looks at the window, that was really the completion of the concept that I wanted to put out there, and just it's almost like fishing, throw it out there and see if a bunch of people start going, where are they? Where I don't understand. Then you need to write more of it.
Right. So, what is your what is your writing process like? Do you have a schedule? Are you someone that needs to write every day, or do you kind of go with when the inspiration hits you? Are you more regimented about it, or are you kind of more artsy
I
about it?
want to be regimented, and I have a desire to be
Yeah.
regimented, and I hang out a lot with Hugh Howey, and I was just with him at Dragon Con, and that guy pulls out his laptop anytime there's a lull in the conversation. The guy can be writing, and I
I noticed at your book signing table,
yeah.
you're like, yeah, Hugh's over here writing a bestseller while
Yeah,
I'm, trying to handle
I would
business.
love to be that, and I do have an intention in my mind to develop that kind of habits. I'm more of the kind of person, though, unhappily, where I may go 2 3 days where I write very little, and then I may do 12,000 word day or 15,000 word day. I knocked out Hugh Allen Must Die, which was 28,000 words. I did that in less than 30 hours, and so
Wow.
and with no editing. So, which was
That's
part of the meta thing of the story. But anyways, I desire to be better at this. I want to be a person that just sits down and knocks out 2,500 or 5,000 words a day. And I know people that are like that. I'm considered to be pretty prolific, but a lot of that's just my old high school way of studying right before the test, or cramming right before the test.
yes, yes. Um, Now, some would argue that it's impossible to put out quality work when you write 10, 12, 15,000 words a day. What would your answer to that
Well,
be?
I would argue that that's there's absolutely no way to know that without looking at the work, because it's not like I don't edit, you know, and
Right.
so whereas someone might spend hours on an outline, I consider my first draft an outline, and so spend a lot of time rewriting, and um, and then I also employ one of the best editors in the business, David Gatewood, and so. The idea that somehow, because of the way that the story comes together, isn't this very systemic type of or systematic type of organization. It's ridiculous because maybe I could just look at it like my first drafts are very, very more in depth um, outline than yours is.
Absolutely. I think what's happened is this new self-publishing revolution has really freed authors to publish as often as they would like.
Right.
And I think there probably would be some other authors who are, uh, within uh, the traditionally published world, and no disparagement to them at all. But I think there would be some of them that would love to publish more often.
Absolutely. This
Uh,
is one of the biggest. Sorry, I interrupted you again.
no, no, I was just going to say that I think what has happened is we see people that put out more often, and it's not exactly what people have been used to. People are used to seeing one book a year, from an author, and they just don't know what to do with
Well,
it.
it's one of the most guarded secrets in all of authordom is that it takes a year to write a book. I mean, that's
Right.
just a scam on the public. That's what the publishers have insisted on. But everyone, I mean, unless you're G.R.R. Martin, everyone in mainstream, everyone I've talked to, I mean, you know, Stephen King writes more than 3,000 4,000 words a day, and so I mean,
Right.
if you just do the math, you know, if he does 3,000 a day, that's over a 90,000 word novel every month.
Yeah, and if you're putting your butt in the chair,
Right.
you're going to
Yeah,
crank out
I
work.
was listening to Hugh talk one day, and he said that he said, if you just do 2,000 words a day, which is, I mean, to me, I can't even introduce myself in 2,000 words. Um, 2,000 words a day, you're talking about 60,000 words a month. You could put out a novel every 2 months if you edit it really, really well and drag your feet. You could do it every 3 months, and you easily could do two novels a year and not really, really sweat much. And so I think there's this kind of mythology that built up that was purposely kind of implanted out there that somehow these writers are sitting down and like agonizing over every word, which just doesn't happen. The writing process is not different between mainstream publishing and indie publishing, as we can tell by looking at the quality um, and what people are
Absolutely.
willing to buy. The process isn't different. The only difference is we've removed this uh, concept that somehow you cannot do it that fast. What was happening during that year with all of the junk that the mainstream pubs and the agents, you send it to your agent, it's with them for 3.5 weeks, and then they send it back for one paragraph change, and you change that paragraph and you send it back, and it's there 3.5 weeks, and then they send it back, and then it goes to the editor, and the editor wants you to rewrite one paragraph. These things, and I've had a little bit of experience with that lately, and those things take months and months and months. That's really what's happening during that year. Very little of that time is actually spent writing.
Yeah, that is insane. You were talking a minute ago about your editing process, and you said that your first draft is like a really detailed outline. Uh, do you physically write a second draft, or do you go through and edit and flesh out your existing document? How does that process work
Yeah, on
for
the
you?
second run through, I'm really I'm doing about 3 or 4 things. I'm editing things out, huge portions that obviously, kind of the Hemingway theory, where I will delete a huge portion and just see if it still makes sense, see if the author, I mean, excuse me, if the reader can fill that in with their mind, if things just aren't necessary. I use Russell Blake's idea that you as you go back through it, you look at a portion, whether it's a page or a paragraph or a a chapter and you go, why is this here? What am I trying to do in this portion? And so there are things that are removed and moved around, and then I go through again as part of my second draft, and I start to add some more poetic sections, and I'll go back, since I know the ending now, I'll go back and start implanting some seeds, Easter eggs, ideas, and concepts that are developed later in the book. All of these.
Putting the gun on the
Right,
mantle.
right, exactly. And actually calling it
Yeah.
Chekhov's gun. I actually have it in Osage 2 Diamonds. I actually have a guy find a rifle and it says Chekhov's gun on there. And, yeah, and so and then that's kind of my second draft comes out is really a good framework, and then I do another run through where I'm actually trying to put it in a polished, finished form.
Do you use any particular software? Is there anything that you rely upon, or you just a Microsoft Word writer?
I'm just
do you like Scrivener?
no, I haven't done any of that. I just can't. Somebody would have to be here with me and teach me how to do it, because I get so, like I said, I won't stand in line if there's 4 people in line, and everybody tells me how great Scrivener is and all, and it probably is. I just don't want to learn it, and so I think
there's a pretty steep learning curve, but there's some pretty amazing things about it. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So tell me about Hugh Howey Must Die. How did that come about?
I was having I was learning about self-publishing, and I was learning about all these myths that were being busted and the conflicts between mainstream legacy publishing and indie publishing. And I've always had this comedic view on life, and I found out about this competition that was going to be held in London in January. And pardon me, the competition, basically this magazine in London had heard about NaNoWriMo, the National Novel Writers Month, where people write a novel in the month of November, and they wanted to kind of poke fun at it. And so they said, what if we have people write a novel in a weekend? So they created NaNoWriWe, National Novel Writers Weekend, and the competition was to write a long form. It had to be more than 25,000 words or something. Piece of fiction, and I think there was 4 or 5 categories, and one of those was satire. And so, and then this thing was going to be sponsored by HarperCollins UK, and I just had this idea that, and at the time, Hugh was going over to London to do a book signing. And so I contacted Hugh and I said, I'm going to get a motel room and I'm going to write a novel in a weekend. It may be a short novel, but it'll be a novel length book in a weekend, and I'm not going to edit it. It's going to be totally meta. So it's what's happening to me as I'm writing it is going to be in the story. And so I just came up with this idea of a zombie attack where the zombies are only eating good writers. They won't eat bad writers. And so the bad writers who want so much to be validated are actually trying to get eaten by these zombies who won't eat them. And so that's kind of where the idea came from. And then as I wrote it, of course I didn't sleep, and I wrote the whole thing in a little over 20 hours actually. And I sent it over to Hugh, and he was just in hysterics. He was laughing so hard, and he said, you have to publish this thing, and you need to publish it and make money off of it. Because I was going to enter it into the whole competition. So I ended up entering it into the competition, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought, isn't this the whole point of what I wrote here? That this is not necessary, right? Because what you won, if you won the competition, was a ebook only contract, which would have been, maybe $1,000 or something advance.
Oh my God.
And so I thought, I'm going to self-publish this thing, and I'm going to sell 1,000 copies in the first 30 days. And so I contacted Hugh, and I contacted all these other authors that I'd met, and we did it. We sold 1,000 copies in the first 30 days, and I pulled it out of the competition. And of course, no one's ever heard of one story that came out of that whole competition. So that was all even part of the story, was how ridiculous that whole idea was.
That is amazing. And you and Hugh have gone on to be pretty good friends, haven't you?
Yeah, it started off there, and we had a few conversations here and there, which he probably has tons of conversations with lots of authors. But we met up at Worldcon in August or late August, early September of 2013, And he really was such a gracious guy, and he was kind of fascinated at our Amish dress, and so he kind of hung out with us the whole time we were there, and took us around and had us meet people, and really kind of made us feel at home in this really strange world for these plain people. And so after that, we kind of increased our communications, and I was writing some wool fanfic and got into doing sand fanfic, and he would talk me up all the time. He was like, almost every video he was saying, hey, you got to read Michael Bunker. And he read Pennsylvania for me and did an awesome blurb. And then it just kind of developed into more of a friendship and a mentor kind of relationship. And so I think we're really good friends now. We're working on some things, and
the Bunker and Silo
right,
show.
right. And that was just something, again, he's very gracious. And we were both, because of him, we were both asked to be on this NPR interview that turned out to be not quite what we wanted it to be. And so
yeah, I heard there was a lot that was left
almost all of it.
Yeah,
you do about an hour and a half interview, and they get about 3 minutes out of it, and it's pretty much just what their narrative was. And I don't blame them for that. That's what they do. But what we had really talked about was something that was so important that we talked, and we said, hey, we need to just do this podcast or this Google Hangout where we talk about these issues, which I think will be very encouraging to authors. And so, and then it went over so well that we're going to start doing it every month.
That's great. I know you've got an episode coming up in the next week or so.
Yeah, September 15th is going to be the next one, and people can just check out my blog, michaelbunker.com, and I'll have information more as the day comes. But it'll be always on YouTube, on Hugh's YouTube, and then we're going to actually start archiving it as a podcast as well.
Well, Michael, we're running right up on an hour now, and thank you so much for being so generous with your time. Where can people find you to learn more about your work and to connect with you?
My blog is michaelbunker.com. That's my author page, too, so you can find my books and all of that there. You can always follow me on Facebook, which is pretty easy. It's just facebook.com/offgrid. Or if you want to put /Michael Bunker, you'll find me too. But /offgrid, you'll find me, and just friend me on Facebook. My Twitter is @mbunker, and I'm always open to talk to people and try to help people out as much as I can. And I like the interaction with a lot of authors, so it's a good way to kind of keep those roots of conversation going.
Absolutely. Well, Michael, thank you for being so gracious with your time and with your story. It's been fascinating. I could literally talk to you for 3 more hours, but
well, thank you. It's been
we'll cut it there. And you've been a huge influence on my writing, and I just want to say thank you and thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me, man. It's been a great time.
Thanks for listening, and as always, find all episodes at hankgarner.com. Follow us on Twitter at Hank the Writer and on Facebook at author Hank Garner.